Imagine yourself standing on a battlefield in October of 1781. The ground quakes beneath your boots, the air is heavy with smoke, and the acrid sting of gunpowder fills your lungs. All around you, thousands of soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder in formation. But something about this day feels different. Something the British could never have predicted. Something that would alter the course of American history forever. This is the story of the secret weapon that shattered the Redcoats at Yorktown, the battle that ended the American War of Independence. Most people remember Yorktown as the final battle of the American Revolution, but few understand why the British, then the most feared and powerful military force on earth, were completely crushed. It wasn't just because of courage, it wasn't only clever strategy, it was because of one specific, unexpected force that caught the British entirely off guard. And today you're going to uncover exactly what that weapon was, how it worked, and why it was so devastatingly effective. Before we go on, if you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit the subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know what time you're watching. Your support helps this channel keep bringing you untold moments from history just like this one. To understand Yorktown's hidden weapon, we have to travel back in time to grasp the situation that led to this decisive moment. By 1781, the American Revolution had dragged on for 6 long, brutal years. The colonists were locked in a desperate struggle against the might of the British Empire, the greatest superpower of the 18th century. It was David versus Goliath on a global scale. The British army was feared across continents. Their soldiers, called Redcoats because of their bright scarlet uniforms, were thought to be nearly unbeatable. They had conquered lands across the world. Their navy ruled the oceans. Their generals were trained in Europe's finest academies. Their weapons and logistics were the best money could buy. The Americans, by contrast, were mostly volunteers, farmers, tradesmen, and merchants who had taken up arms for freedom. They lacked training, discipline, and equipment. Many didn't even have proper uniforms. Their rifles were often the same ones they used for hunting. Some had never experienced battle before joining the revolutionary cause. In the early years, the American forces suffered defeat after defeat. New York was lost. Philadelphia fell. It looked as though the rebellion would be crushed and the colonies forced back under British rule. But then came a turning point in 1778. France, still smarting from its humiliating loss to Britain in the 7 Years' War, decided to join the Americans. This alliance with France was absolutely vital, but not for the reasons most people assume. Yes, the French sent soldiers. Yes, they shipped supplies and weapons. But their greatest gift to the American cause wasn't manpower or muskets. It was something far more powerful, something that would tilt the entire balance of the war. Fast forward to the summer of 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis, commander of forces in the South, had pursued the Continental Army through the Carolinas and into Virginia. His men were exhausted, but still confident. Under orders to secure a naval base on Virginia's coast, Cornwallis chose the small town of Yorktown, a spot perfectly located on a peninsula between the York and James rivers. He had roughly 7,500 soldiers under his command. Believing he could repel any American assault, Cornwallis fortified the town with trenches, redoubts, and defensive works. From his perspective, Yorktown was impenetrable. The Americans had no navy strong enough to challenge British control of the sea. Even if they tried to besiege him, the Royal Navy could easily sail in, resupply his troops, or evacuate them safely. But there was one thing Cornwallis didn't know. George Washington and the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, were quietly preparing a daring plan that would rewrite history. They were coordinating a massive joint operation, uniting land and sea forces with flawless timing across hundreds of miles, and all of it had to be done in complete secrecy. At the time, Washington was camped near New York, where he had spent months plotting an attack on the British garrison occupying the city since 1776. But when he received news that a large French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse was sailing toward America, everything changed. Washington realized he had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Admiral de Grasse commanded an enormous armada, 28 ships of the line, the largest and most powerful warships of their age. Each carried between 60 and 80 cannons, floating fortresses capable of obliterating entire cities or engaging whole fleets at sea. And de Grasse had chosen to sail not for New York, but for the Chesapeake Bay, directly toward Cornwallis's position at Yorktown. This was the secret weapon. Not a new kind of gunpowder, not an ingenious invention, but naval supremacy on a scale the British never expected to face in American waters. The French fleet would give Washington something he'd never had before: absolute control of the sea. It would trap Cornwallis's army, cut off reinforcements, and prevent escape by ship. Yorktown, once a stronghold, would become a trap, a cage from which there was no way out. But there was one enormous challenge. For Washington's plan to succeed, his army would have to march from New York to Virginia, over 400 miles, without the British realizing his true objective. If they discovered the plan, the British could intercept him on the road or evacuate Cornwallis before the siege even began. Washington, ever the master strategist, turned to deception. He set out to convince the British that he still intended to attack New York. He ordered the construction of fake bread ovens near the city to suggest preparations for a long siege. He made sure British scouts saw his men conducting reconnaissance around enemy defenses, and he deliberately leaked false intelligence through known double agents, spies who reported directly to the British command. Every move was calculated, every detail deliberate. While the British remained fixated on defending New York, Washington's army quietly began its long march south toward destiny at Yorktown. Meanwhile, Washington was quietly moving his army southward under a veil of secrecy. In August of 1781, the combined American and French forces under General Rochambeau began their long march. They moved swiftly but carefully, avoiding major roads whenever they could, to keep their true destination hidden. Washington divided his troops into several columns to confuse spies and onlookers about their actual numbers and where they were heading. The march to Yorktown would become one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the entire war. Transporting more than 7,000 American soldiers and 5,000 French troops, along with mountains of supplies, artillery, wagons, and equipment, over hundreds of miles of rough terrain was an enormous undertaking. They needed food, water, shelter, ammunition, and coordination at every stage. They had to cross rivers, push through forests, and climb over ridges, all while racing against time before the British realized what was unfolding. By the time the British command in New York discovered that Washington had vanished, it was far too late. The American army was already deep into its march toward Virginia, and worse still for the British, Admiral de Grasse's massive fleet had already reached the Chesapeake Bay. The French ships immediately blockaded the bay's entrance, cutting off British access to Yorktown. Then on September 5, 1781, the British Navy arrived with 19 ships of the line under Admiral Thomas Graves. Graves expected an easy mission. He believed the bay was unguarded and that he could sail in freely to resupply or evacuate Cornwallis. Instead, he was met by de Grasse's larger, perfectly positioned French fleet. What followed was the Battle of the Virginia Capes, also known as the Battle of the Chesapeake, one of the most pivotal yet least celebrated naval battles in American history. For hours, the two fleets exchanged devastating broadsides, cannons roared, masts splintered, and the air filled with smoke and fire. Men screamed and ships burned as iron shot tore through wooden hulls. Though the fight ended without a clear victory in terms of ships destroyed, its strategic outcome was monumental. the French retained control of the bay. After assessing the heavy damage to his own fleet and realizing he was outgunned, Admiral Graves made the fateful decision to withdraw to New York for repairs. That single move sealed the fate of General Cornwallis. With the Chesapeake now under French control, Cornwallis's army at Yorktown was completely isolated. No reinforcements could arrive, no supplies could be delivered, no escape by sea was possible. He was trapped, cut off, with barely 7,000 men, while an Allied force of more than 16,000 Americans and French soldiers advanced to surround him. By late September, Washington and Rochambeau arrived at Yorktown. They wasted no time. The Allied forces encircled the town, blocking every land route and tightening the noose. Cornwallis had built strong defensive lines, but those very fortifications now became the walls of his own prison. But let's return to the real secret weapon. Yes, the French fleet's dominance at sea was essential. Without it, the siege could never have taken place. However, there was another French contribution, just as decisive, perhaps even more so: their unmatched expertise in engineering and artillery. The French were renowned as the best artillerists in all of Europe. Their cannon designs were superior, their metal casting techniques refined, and their gunners were trained through decades of continuous warfare across the continent. And when they arrived at Yorktown, they brought all that mastery with them. 18th century artillery may not look impressive to modern eyes, but back then it was the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. A single siege gun could hurl 8, 12, or even 24-pound iron balls over long distances. Those projectiles could smash through fortifications, rip apart defenses, and kill dozens of men in an instant. The French brought heavy siege cannons, massive mortars that could lob explosive shells high into the air to rain down within enemy lines, and the relatively new howitzers, a hybrid weapon that combined the best features of both cannons and mortars. Most importantly, they brought soldiers who knew exactly how to use them with devastating precision. The siege of Yorktown would become an artillery duel, a test of firepower and endurance. Whichever side could deliver the most accurate bombardment, silence the enemy's guns first, and tear down fortifications faster would win. And in this contest, the Americans and French held the clear upper hand. Washington and Rochambeau resisted the urge to launch a direct assault. They knew charging the British lines head-on would cost thousands of lives. Instead, they decided to conduct a formal European-style siege, a methodical operation refined over centuries of warfare. The first step was to dig what was known as the First Parallel, a long trench running parallel to the British defences, but far enough away to stay beyond cannon range. On the night of October 6th, soldiers worked feverishly in near silence, digging by hand under cover of darkness. By dawn, they had completed more than 3,000 meters of trench line. Once it was finished, teams began hauling the great cannons into position. It was back-breaking labor. Each cannon weighed hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilograms. They had to be dragged over uneven ground, carefully positioned, and anchored firmly before they could be fired. The French engineers, masters of efficiency, directed every step flawlessly. Finally, on October 9th, the Allied batteries were ready. General Washington himself took the honor of firing the opening shot. The cannonball arced through the air and crashed directly into a table where several British officers were dining, killing one instantly. It was a chilling omen, a signal that the final and most decisive phase of the war for independence had begun. And then all hell broke loose. More than 50 Allied guns and mortars unleashed their fury on the British lines. The roar of cannon fire was deafening, shaking the ground with every blast. Thick smoke blanketed the sky, turning day into night, while British fortifications splintered and collapsed under the relentless storm of iron and fire. The French gunners displayed extraordinary skill. They could calculate trajectories with uncanny precision, adjusting their aim within moments after each shot. Their cannons fired faster, more accurately, and more consistently than the British guns, which often overheated, cracked, or exploded from overuse. The French artillery crews were disciplined and calm, their movements synchronized like clockwork. Each shot found its mark, tearing through walls and scattering British troops in terror. The mortars were especially horrifying. They hurled iron bombs high into the air, their fiery fuses glowing like stars before plunging down almost vertically into the British defences. When these shells exploded, jagged shards of iron tore through everything and everyone nearby. There was no hiding from them, trenches offered no safety, and even soldiers deep below ground were struck by flying fragments. The psychological toll was immense. Every shriek of incoming fire could mean death within seconds. Cornwallis tried to fight back. His own gunners responded with what strength they had left, but they were hopelessly outmatched. He had fewer cannons, less ammunition, and crews far less skilled than their French counterparts. Worse still, their defensive positions were being reduced to rubble. One after another, British guns fell silent, some destroyed outright, others abandoned when their positions became impossible to hold. After days of ceaseless bombardment, Washington and Rochambeau ordered the next phase of the siege, the construction of the second parallel, an even closer trench line that would allow their guns to pound the British from near point-blank range. But there was a major obstacle. Two British outposts, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, stood squarely in the path of where the new trench needed to go. These small but heavily fortified positions guarded the approaches to Yorktown. Each was manned by determined defenders, armed with muskets and small cannon. If the Allies wanted to finish their siege lines, those redoubts had to fall. And that meant a direct assault. On the night of October 14th, Washington gave the order. Both redoubts would be attacked simultaneously. Redoubt 10 would fall to the Americans, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, the same man who would later become the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Redoubt 9 would be stormed by French troops under Baron de Viomenil. The attacks would be fast, silent, and deadly. The soldiers were instructed to use bayonets only, to move under cover of darkness, and to fire no shots until absolutely necessary. It was a perilous gamble, but if it worked, victory would be within reach. At 8 o'clock that night, the assaults began. Hamilton led his men in a furious charge toward Redoubt 10. The British saw the attackers and opened fire, but it was too late. The Americans surged forward, smashing through the outer defenses and scaling the walls with ladders and sheer determination. Inside, chaos erupted. The fighting was brutal and close, men grappling hand to hand in the dim light, bayonets flashing in the moonlight. Within minutes, the Americans overwhelmed the defenders. Hamilton's men had taken Redoubt 10. At the same time, the French launched their attack on Redoubt 9. Their disciplined ranks advanced steadily through the darkness, muskets fixed with gleaming steel. Despite fierce resistance, the British defenders were outnumbered and overrun. In less than 30 minutes, both redoubts were in Allied hands. The path for the second parallel was now clear. The fall of those redoubts was a devastating blow to Cornwallis. With the new trench completed, the Allied artillery could move dangerously close to his main defences. At that range, his position was no longer defensible. Cornwallis knew he was in dire straits. He considered every possible escape. Could he break out by land? Impossible. The Allied army surrounded Yorktown completely. Could he flee by sea? Not a chance. The French fleet still commanded the Chesapeake. His only hope lay in one desperate move. On the night of October 16th, Cornwallis ordered a secret evacuation. Under cover of darkness, boats were prepared along the York River. He planned to ferry his troops across to the opposite shore and escape northward, perhaps to join other British forces. The first group successfully made it across the river, their oars silent in the night. But then nature turned against them. A sudden and violent storm swept through the region. Winds howled, rain lashed down, and the waves grew too wild for the small boats to handle. The evacuation collapsed in chaos. Those who had crossed were stranded and forced to return the next morning, under heavy Allied artillery fire. Cornwallis's final chance at escape had vanished. His situation was hopeless. The fortifications lay in ruins. His cannons were destroyed. His men were starving, sick, and exhausted. Morale was gone. With every sunrise, the Allied bombardment grew louder, closer, and more accurate. The once proud British army was being pounded into submission. Then on the morning of October 17, 1781, exactly 4 years after the American victory at Saratoga, a lone British drummer climbed onto the shattered remains of a fortification. Through the thunder of guns he began to beat the call for parley, the signal for truce and negotiation. At first, the sound was almost drowned out by the constant roar of cannon fire. But slowly the Allied guns fell silent. A British officer appeared, carrying a white flag. He bore a letter from General Cornwallis to General Washington, requesting a 24-hour ceasefire to discuss the terms of surrender. Washington refused the full day. He granted Cornwallis just 2 hours to present his proposal. The end of the war for independence was finally in sight. The correspondence continued late into the night, with letters exchanged back and forth as both sides sought an honorable end to the siege. By the morning of October 18th, representatives from the American, French, and British commands gathered at the Moore House, a nearby residence that had miraculously survived the Relentless bombardment. There, within its battered but standing walls, they discussed the exact terms of Cornwallis's surrender. Cornwallis's envoys argued earnestly for leniency, attempting to secure favorable conditions for their men. Washington, though firm and uncompromising where principle demanded, was measured and just in his final decisions. By evening, the terms were settled. The British troops were to lay down their arms and become prisoners of war. Officers, as a gesture of respect for their rank, would retain their swords. The soldiers would be allowed to keep their personal possessions. However, in a deliberate act of symbolism, the British would not be permitted to march out with their flags flying or to play either a British or an American march. This was no small detail. It denied them the honors of war, a pointed echo of how the British had humiliated the Americans after the fall of Charleston the year before. On October 19th, 1781, the formal surrender ceremony took place. The field outside Yorktown transformed into a stage of history. 2 long columns stretched for more than a kilometer, Americans on one side, French on the other, standing shoulder to shoulder in silent formation. Between them, the defeated British army marched forward to surrender their weapons. Cornwallis himself did not appear, claiming illness, though many believed it was shame that kept him away. Instead, his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, carried out the duty. Approaching first the French commander, the Count de Rochambeau, O'Hara attempted to surrender to him, perhaps hoping that yielding to the French would be less humiliating. But Rochambeau, with quiet dignity, gestured toward General Washington. O'Hara then turned to Washington, offering the sword of surrender directly to him. Washington, adhering strictly to military protocol, refused to take the sword from a subordinate of Cornwallis. He directed O'Hara to present it instead to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, the same man who had been forced to surrender at Charleston the year before. It was a gesture heavy with justice and symbolism, restoring the honor once denied. As the ceremony continued, British soldiers marched through the lane formed by their conquerors to the field where they were to stack their arms. Many wept openly, some trembling with rage or despair. A few smashed their muskets on the ground rather than hand them over intact. Officers shouted to restore discipline, their voices strained and hollow. The British band played a mournful tune that seemed to capture the magnitude of the moment. The world turned upside down. And indeed, it had. The empire that had dominated continents, the army that had once seemed invincible, now stood defeated by the unlikely alliance of American revolutionaries and French allies. In a single coastal town in Virginia, The might of Great Britain had bowed to a new nation's resolve. Over 7,000 British soldiers were taken captive. Hundreds of cannons and thousands of muskets fell into Allied hands, along with vast stores of ammunition and supplies. Yet it was not the material loss that mattered most, it was the psychological and political shock. When the news reached London, the British government was stunned. Prime Minister Lord North, upon hearing of Cornwallis's surrender, reportedly cried out, "Oh God! It's all over!" And he was right. Although formal peace would take nearly 2 more years to finalize, Yorktown marked the true end of the American War of Independence. Britain never again launched a major campaign in the Americas. Negotiations began the following year, culminating in the Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783. That treaty recognized the independence of the United States and established its borders, granting the new nation all lands east of the Mississippi and south of the Great Lakes. It was a complete victory for the Americans, and a defining moment for the world. Yet the triumph was not born of American strength alone. The true secret lay in the alliance and the synergy it created. French naval power had sealed off Yorktown, preventing any hope of British escape or reinforcement. French artillery, superior in both design and operation, shattered the enemy's defenses. French engineers, trained through generations of military science, oversaw the construction of the precise, deadly siege lines that brought the British to their knees. But beyond their technical mastery was something greater, the idea of an international alliance fighting for liberty. For the first time, an established European power had supported a colonial revolution, not merely for political gain, but also out of shared belief in human freedom. France's aid was both strategic and ideological, a union of interest and idealism. The French artillery at Yorktown symbolized more than destructive force. It represented centuries of scientific advancement, disciplined education, and industrial innovation. Their superiority in gunnery came from decades of investment in metallurgy, mathematics, and engineering. Institutions like the École Polytechnique trained generations of officers in the art and science of war, blending intellect with precision. The Americans, through their partnership, absorbed invaluable lessons. They witnessed the decisive impact of trained artillerymen, of organized logistics, of coordinated land and sea operations. These experiences shaped the nation's military philosophy for decades to come. Alexander Hamilton, the young commander who led the daring assault on Redoubt 10, would later advocate for a national military academy, an idea that culminated in the creation of West Point. Washington, deeply shaped by the hardships of war, would push for a standing, professional army capable of defending the new republic. Yorktown had shown him the power of preparation, unity, and foresight. The siege itself was also a masterclass in logistics, moving 16,000 troops, hundreds of artillery pieces, and mountains of supplies across rough terrain, while maintaining coordination between Allied armies and navies, was an extraordinary feat. It demanded meticulous planning, efficient organization, and constant adaptability, skills that the French had refined through centuries of European warfare, and which the Americans would now begin to study. Technologically, the cannons used at Yorktown were among the finest weapons of their era. Cast from bronze or iron, they balanced strength with mobility. Each gun required careful calibration. Its barrel's diameter had to match perfectly with the cannonballs to ensure accuracy and distance. French gunners calculated each shot with mathematical precision, taking into account the gun's angle, the charge of powder, the weight of the ball, the wind, and even the temperature of the air. They relied on firing tables, early scientific instruments of warfare, that allowed them to adapt instantly to changing conditions. It was war elevated to a science, and at Yorktown, that science had reshaped history. The thunder of French artillery and the discipline of American resolve together brought the world's mightiest empire to its knees. And in that moment, on that quiet field in Virginia, a new world was born. It was a perfect blend of science and art, an exacting discipline that took years to truly master. The mortars used at Yorktown were particularly fascinating from a technical perspective. Unlike traditional cannons, which fired in relatively flat lines, mortars were designed to shoot at steep angles, sending their projectiles high into the air along graceful parabolic arcs. This unique design allowed them to strike targets hidden behind walls and fortifications, raining destruction on positions that ordinary cannons could not reach. But this also made their operation far more complicated. Each shot demanded intricate mathematical calculations. The gunners had to judge distance, angle, charge, and fuse timing with near-perfect precision. The bombs fired from mortars were among the most terrifying weapons of the siege. They were hollow iron spheres packed with gunpowder, each fitted with a small hole for a fuse. Before firing, the fuse was lit, and its burn time carefully estimated so the bomb would explode just after landing near the target. A fuse that burned too long meant the bomb would detonate too late, perhaps after burying itself harmlessly in the earth. A fuse that was too short could cause it to explode in mid-air, reducing its effect, or even endangering the gunners themselves. Sometimes the fuse failed altogether. Moisture or damage could extinguish it, leaving behind an unexploded shell, silent but deadly. Brave men had to creep forward under fire to neutralize these ticking bombs, a task as dangerous as any on the battlefield. And in some daring cases, defenders managed to relight these duds and send them back toward their attackers, turning the weapon against its makers. The bombardment at Yorktown was relentless, deafening, and unending. During the course of the siege, it's estimated that over 3,000 cannonballs and mortar shells rained down upon the British lines. Day and night, the thunder of artillery never ceased. The ground trembled constantly under the shock of explosions. British soldiers later wrote that it was impossible to sleep, to rest, or even to think clearly amid the never-ending noise. The psychological torment was as crushing as the physical destruction. Conditions for the British defenders grew nightmarish. The unbroken bombardment was only part of their suffering. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, with no chance of resupply. The French fleet's blockade made certain of that. The water had turned foul and undrinkable. Diseases like dysentery and fever spread quickly through the crowded, filthy encampments. Wounded men lay in makeshift hospitals that were themselves constantly targeted by enemy fire. Cornwallis struggled to maintain order and morale, but despair was spreading faster than hope. His soldiers could see the truth with their own eyes, the thousands of Allied troops tightening their encirclement, the French ships ruling the bay, the endless roar of guns that outmatched theirs in every way. Deep down they knew there would be no victory. There would be no escape. The French superiority in artillery was not simply a matter of quantity, it was mastery in every aspect. Their cannons were forged using more advanced metallurgical techniques, producing stronger and more dependable barrels. Their gunpowder was purer, more powerful, and consistent. Their cannonballs were more uniform in weight and size, delivering greater range and accuracy. And above all, their gunners were expertly trained. A French artilleryman's education was a study in discipline and intellect. They learned mathematics, geometry, and physics to understand every variable that could alter a projectile's flight. They practiced loading and firing until it became instinctive, able to operate under the pressure of chaos and death. They could swiftly estimate distances, angles, and powder charges by sight. They studied how different ammunition types affected various fortifications and troop formations, allowing them to tailor their fire for maximum devastation. At Yorktown, a wide variety of ammunition was employed, each chosen with precision. Solid cannonballs were the workhorses, perfect for smashing through walls and structures. Canister shot, filled with small metal balls or nails, turned each gun into a giant shotgun, devastating enemy soldiers at close range. Explosive shells created fear and chaos, scattering deadly fragments in all directions. And then there were hot shot. iron balls heated until they glowed red, designed to ignite wooden defenses or ships. The French used each type with remarkable expertise, knowing exactly when and where each would have the greatest effect. They hurled solid shot to batter the British redoubts, used grapeshot to break up infantry formations, and unleashed explosive shells to sow terror among the defenders. Every strike seemed to demonstrate not just skill, but an artful understanding of destruction. The coordination among the Allied artillery units was equally impressive. Communication between the French and Americans was highly organized, allowing them to focus the fire of multiple batteries on precise targets. Observers scanned the battlefield for weaknesses or active British guns. Once a target was identified, orders spread instantly, and dozens of cannons turned in unison. Their combined firepower obliterated strongpoints one by one, conserving ammunition while maximizing devastation. Behind this destructive harmony were the French engineers, the architects of the siege itself. They designed and supervised the construction of the siege lines, a feat requiring deep understanding of geometry, terrain, and tactics. Every trench had to be carefully measured and executed. They dug deep enough to shield soldiers from fire, yet not so deep that the ditches filled with water. They were wide enough to move men and equipment efficiently, but narrow enough to conserve labor and materials. The trenches were cut in zigzag patterns to prevent enemy fire from sweeping straight through their length. Gun positions were fortified with parapets, each designed to protect the gunners while giving them clear fields of fire. Every battery supported another, arranged so that if one position fell silent, others could still cover it. All were linked by communication trenches, narrow, winding arteries that allowed soldiers, supplies, and ammunition to flow safely across the front. Constructing this network demanded immense effort and endurance. Thousands of soldiers toiled each night, digging through the hard Virginia earth with shovels and pickaxes under the pale light of lanterns. They labored while British guns roared above them, each blast sending sprays of soil and stone into the air. Exhaustion was constant, but progress never stopped. French engineers had perfected techniques that balanced speed and safety, ensuring steady advancement even under fire. One of their key methods was the sap, a tactical approach to advance trenches toward the enemy. Workers moved forward behind large wicker baskets filled with earth, called gabions, which shielded them from musket and shrapnel fire. Step by step, night after night, the lines crept closer to the British defences, tightening the noose around Yorktown. And when the final guns were in place, the sky itself seemed to thunder with French precision and American resolve. As the trench advanced, more gabions were steadily added. It was a slow but reliable method to approach enemy fortifications with safety and precision. Another ingenious French technique was the use of fascines, bundles of branches tightly bound together to reinforce trenches and fill ditches. They also employed sausages, long cylindrical fascines placed along the tops of trenches to provide extra protection from enemy fire. These methods had been refined through centuries of European warfare and were executed to perfection at Yorktown. The French contribution to the victory at Yorktown cannot be overstated. Without their fleet, Cornwallis would never have been trapped. He could have escaped or received reinforcements. Without their powerful artillery and trained gunners, the British defences might have held far longer. Without their skilled engineers, the siege would not have been conducted with such precision and speed. And without the French soldiers themselves, Washington simply would not have had enough men to completely encircle Yorktown. Yet the American effort must not be overlooked. American troops fought with astonishing courage and determination. The assault on Redoubt 10, commanded by Alexander Hamilton, was executed with boldness and brilliance. George Washington's leadership was indispensable. His ability to maintain harmony with the French allies and coordinate the immense logistics of the siege was a triumph of command. Above all, it was the American spirit, the passion for freedom and independence, that gave meaning and unity to the entire struggle. The Franco-American Sea alliance at Yorktown was a remarkable display of international cooperation. Naturally, challenges arose. Language barriers made communication difficult. Cultural differences occasionally caused friction. The French, seasoned in the structured traditions of European warfare, sometimes clashed with the Americans' more adaptive and improvisational approach. But both sides showed patience and maturity, focusing on the common goal that bound them together. The French commander, Rochambeau, deserves special praise for his tact and wisdom. He possessed more military experience than Washington and led troops who were better trained and equipped. He could easily have demanded overall command, but he chose not to. He understood that unity required humility. To preserve the alliance's strength, it was vital that Washington be seen as the supreme commander. Rochambeau's consistent deference to Washington, even when offering expert counsel, showed his deep respect and diplomacy. Admiral de Grasse also merits immense credit. His bold decision to bring his fleet to the Chesapeake Bay, rather than New York as Washington initially suggested, changed everything. He foresaw that cutting off Cornwallis at Yorktown offered the best chance for a decisive victory. De Grasse risked his entire fleet against the British Navy, and his triumph at the Battle of the Chesapeake sealed Cornwallis's fate. His ships not only blockaded Yorktown, preventing any escape or aid, but also carried reinforcements and vital supplies, gunpowder, ammunition, and even heavy artillery. His naval guns supported parts of the siege, and his very presence was a constant reminder to Cornwallis that he was trapped, isolated, and doomed. It is astonishing to realize how many delicate threads had to align perfectly for Yorktown to become the turning point it was. Had de Grasse arrived a few days later, Cornwallis might have escaped. Had the storm not interrupted Cornwallis's desperate attempt to cross the river, part of his army might have gotten away. Had the British in New York realized Washington's true intentions sooner, they could have attacked his supply lines or sent reinforcements. History often pivots on moments like these: a delayed message, an unexpected storm, a single hesitant decision, each carrying the power to change the fate of nations. At Yorktown, fate seemed to favor freedom. The consequences of Yorktown rippled across the world. American independence gave birth to a new form of government, founded on democratic ideals and individual liberty. Just a few years later, the United States Constitution would become a guiding light for democratic movements everywhere. The ideals of liberty and equality declared in the American Revolution inspired revolutions and reform movements across Europe and beyond. But victory came at a cost. For France, supporting the American cause was immensely expensive. That financial burden contributed to the economic crisis that later helped ignite the French Revolution. French soldiers who had fought beside Americans returned home, carrying the seeds of revolutionary thought, ideas of freedom and human rights that would soon challenge their own monarchy. In this way, Yorktown not only shaped America's destiny, but helped spark the transformation of France itself. For Britain, Yorktown was a crushing blow, not fatal, but deeply humbling. Though they lost the American colonies, they still possessed a vast empire. They learned from the loss about the limits of force and the importance of maintaining political legitimacy and public support. In later years, Britain adapted, governing other colonies with greater flexibility and less tyranny. The technology on display at Yorktown also marked a milestone in military evolution. Artillery grew ever more precise and destructive in the years that followed. Fortifications evolved to resist heavier bombardments. Siege tactics advanced until the invention of explosive shells and rifled cannons would revolutionize warfare entirely. Yet in 1781, the French and American artillery at Yorktown represented the pinnacle of contemporary military science. Those cannons, directed by expert gunners and supported by meticulous engineers, unleashed devastating power upon the British defences. The secret weapon that crushed the Redcoats was not a mystery hidden in steel or powder. It was the perfect combination of unity, coordination, and timing. The British knew the French had great ships, skilled gunners, and expert engineers. What they failed to anticipate was how flawlessly all these forces would come together under a shared purpose. Cornwallis assumed his fortifications could endure until help arrived. He assumed British naval dominance would ensure his safety. He assumed the Americans lacked the discipline to wage a true European-style siege. Every one of those assumptions was proven fatally wrong. The Franco-American alliance shattered those illusions completely. Yorktown was not just a military defeat for Britain, it was a psychological one. It proved that the mighty British Empire could be humbled. It showed that when nations unite behind a cause greater than themselves, freedom, self-determination, and justice, even the most powerful armies in the world can be overcome. Yorktown was more than the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new age. For the soldiers who fought at Yorktown, both American and French, it was a moment of immense triumph. They had faced what was considered the finest army in the world, and they had prevailed. Many of these men would carry the memory of Yorktown for the rest of their lives. Some went on to become leaders in the young American Republic. Others returned to France, where they would soon find themselves swept into their own revolution. Every one of them understood that they had taken part in something extraordinary, an event that would change history forever. The power of artillery at Yorktown set a new standard for warfare. It became clear that well-directed artillery could decide the outcome of sieges and battles alike. Armies around the world began investing more heavily in cannons, munitions, and artillery training. Military academies expanded their mathematics and engineering programs to better prepare officers for the technical demands of commanding artillery units. War was becoming increasingly scientific, dependent not only on courage, but on knowledge, precision, and innovation. Yorktown also revealed the critical importance of naval power. The French fleet's ability to blockade the harbour and repel the British attempt to break through was absolutely decisive. This fact did not go unnoticed by American leaders. In the years that followed, fierce debates arose over whether the United States should develop its own navy. Ultimately, they decided it must, leading to the creation of the United States Navy, which would grow to become the most powerful maritime force on Earth. The cooperation between land and sea forces at Yorktown was revolutionary for its time. Coordination between armies and navies was notoriously difficult. Each had different chains of command, distinct cultures, and often conflicting priorities. But at Yorktown, Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse achieved an extraordinary level of unity. Each understood the importance of the other's role, and together they executed one of the most perfectly coordinated operations of the 18th century. Their success became a model of joint warfare that would be studied and imitated by future generations of military leaders. The lessons of Yorktown still echo through history. It taught the enduring value of alliances, the necessity of technological superiority, the importance of capable leadership, and the power of coordination among diverse forces. These principles remain fundamental to modern military strategy. But perhaps the most powerful lesson of Yorktown is one of perseverance. For 6 long years, the Americans had fought against overwhelming odds. They had endured bitter winters, crushing defeats, hunger, and disease. They had seen homes destroyed, families torn apart, and fortunes lost. Yet they never surrendered their belief in the cause of freedom. George Washington embodied that unwavering resolve. He had led the Continental Army through its darkest moments, holding his men together when despair threatened to tear them apart. He had inspired them to continue fighting when victory seemed beyond reach. And at Yorktown, after years of relentless struggle, he finally saw his faith rewarded. The victory was not merely military, it was moral. It proved that courage and conviction could triumph over power and privilege. The story of Yorktown, at its heart, is the story of ideas. The soldiers who fought there were not driven by the promise of wealth or land, but by belief. They believed that all men were created equal. They believed in liberty, in self-government, and in the right to shape their own destiny. These convictions were more powerful than Britain's cannons and muskets, for armies can conquer ground, but they cannot conquer the human spirit. The British learned that truth at Yorktown. They might have possessed the mightiest navy and the most disciplined army, but they faced a people who valued freedom more than life itself. The victory at Yorktown would have been impossible without French assistance, their ships, their artillery, their engineers, and their soldiers. But the reason they fought alongside the Americans was deeper than politics. They too believed in liberty and equality. In that shared faith, the French and Americans found unity. Yorktown was not only a victory for America, it was a victory for the ideals that unite all free people. As we reach the end of this story and uncover the secret weapon that destroyed the Redcoats, we must remember that history is not just made of tactics and tools, it is made of people. It is shaped by their dreams, their courage, their sacrifices, and their hope for something greater. The men who fought at Yorktown, both those who triumphed and those who fell, were real human beings with families and fears. Many never returned home. They lie beneath American soil, far from those they loved, yet their sacrifice endures in the freedom they helped secure. Their struggle was not in vain. They built the foundation of a nation that continues to inspire the world more than 2 centuries later. They proved that true power lies not only in weapons, but in ideas, and in the will to defend them. The secret weapon at Yorktown was not just French naval strength or superior artillery. It was something far greater, the alliance between people who shared a vision of a better world. It was the determination of ordinary men to achieve extraordinary things. It was proof that when people unite behind a just cause, no obstacle is insurmountable. As we reflect on Yorktown and its lasting legacy, let us be thankful. Thankful for those who fought and died for freedom. Thankful for the wisdom of leaders who knew when to seek allies and when to risk everything in one decisive strike. Thankful for the providence that brought together so many forces of men, of nations, of fate at just the right moment in history. Above all, we give thanks to Almighty God for His divine providence, which guided every event that led to freedom and independence, for the courage He gave to those who faced death without fear, for the wisdom He granted to leaders who made crucial decisions, for the storm He sent to prevent Cornwallis's escape, for every unseen miracle that combined to make victory at Yorktown possible. We thank Him for His invisible hand in history, guiding humanity toward His greater purpose. All glory and honor belong to Him who makes the impossible possible, who continues to direct the fate of nations. May we always recognize His sovereignty over all things and be ever grateful for His countless blessings. Amen.